Today we're going to talk about how to add damage to clothing in 1/35th scale. I'll be using this two-part putty here. It's from Green Stuff World. You just cut the desired amount, and then you're going to mix it until it's completely green. You're also going to want a little bit of tap water and some sculpting tools. So once it's completely green, go ahead and apply it to your 1/35th scale figure anywhere that you want to simulate some kind of rip or tear in the clothing. In this instance, we're going to be simulating that this German was shot right there in the chest, and the bullet tore up the front of his jacket there. So once you get it to adhere to the resin itself, if you have issues with that, you can always sand the resin a little bit. You're going to want to get that tool, and you'll notice I've got the tool a little wet with just regular tap water, and that's going to prevent the tool from sticking to that green stuff putty. You can use the tool to press that putty down into the resin, push it into the edges around the fingers in this case, and that'll really ensure that it's stuck on there. Now, it might be a little easier to see this one just because his hand's not in the way, but again, you're just using this tool to really ensure that this putty is pressed down into the clothing. And once you start to simulate that hole, the hardest part is just getting the rest of the putty to blend into the clothing so that it doesn't look like a piece of putty placed on top of the clothing. It actually looks like the clothing and the putty are one, and then the hole in the putty is actually the hole in the clothing. The first tool I was using was a scribing tool. This one is a dental pick, but as you can see, the tip of the dental pick on both ends broke off a while ago, so I'm using that blunt edge and then the flat edge as well, just to help kind of shape this a little bit. And I'll wind up going back and forth and reworking this hole, the hole on his chest, and we'll go ahead and put a third hole on his right knee. It's easier to add damage to clothing like this if the figure itself has a lot of detail, like folds, pockets, or whatever it is, because it's very easy to know where that hole is going to be, where the rest of the putty has to blend into. The hard part is actually on a piece like this right here, because this figure's knee on the left side is relatively smooth. There's not a lot of folds nearby, so you can't really tell exactly what the fabric wants to do. Here I'm just using a brush with some tap water to wet the surface of the putty, and you can do that instead of having to wet the tools. And that's something I do like about this green stuff putty, is it's very easy to work. You have a pretty good amount of time to work with it, especially if you just add a little bit of water to it. And you can see just right now how it's smoothing right out. To give you an idea about how much time you really can work with it, it took me over half an hour to shoot this video. I think I had at least half an hour of footage, and I wasn't shooting the whole time. It was still somewhat workable by the time I finished, and then you want it to dry for a good 24 hours just to really ensure that it's hardened up after the fact. Now this section I've been showing you is at real-time speed. I just wanted to show you what it's like to actually work it. But most of this footage, since I did have over half an hour of footage, is sped up to about 2 times speed. So I think maybe subconsciously I was inspired to use this kind of technique after seeing how movie FX people add lacerations and cuts and bullet wounds and things like that. I've gone ahead and started adding that third hole into the right pant leg. But whether it's movie props or EMT, medical training, military training, whatever it is, oftentimes with the moulage kits, they'll add something, whether it's wax or rubber or latex, something like that. They'll add it to the skin, and it gives it that three-dimensional texture, and then they'll go ahead and blend it into the skin, add the blood, maybe other textured products, and it'll look somewhat realistic. Now with the right knee, hopefully you can see what I was talking about, where all these extra folds that come pre-sculpted into the figure make it that much easier to really blend in the ripped pant leg. What's great about adding these kind of details is it really provides not only some realistic texture and some interest to the figure, but it makes it that much more relatable to the viewer, because everybody out there has at one point in time or another probably ripped a hole in their pant leg, so they can see the effect, they can look at it, it looks realistic, and it makes it look more more human, gives more character to the plastic or resin figure. Once you get the outer edges of the putty blended into the clothing and the transition is smooth, you can go back to the inside where the rip portion would be and make those edges look a little more ragged. You can use an X-Acto knife, you can use the scribing tool or a dental pick, something like that, to start to pull at the edges of the fabric. What you're trying to do is create some raised texture, something to give you a guide when you're painting, whether you decide to dry brush it or go in with oils and highlight it or whatever it is. You want to be able to almost have like that roadmap to be able to come in and touch those areas and be able to run a wash over everything and really distinguish between whether it's like the hole there with his knee, if that's skin color inside with a pant color on the outside, or if it's a hole in his great coat. You want to be able to have that like a lighter faded green for the pants and then that kind of darker gray green for the coat. You want to be able to differentiate those colors and add some fake shadows or some soaked in blood effects, whatever it is you want to do to really make that hole stand out. This is just that initial step. Now here you'll see that I'm starting to pull away a lot of this excess. I decided that even though it was fairly smooth, it just was a lot of putty and it was too raised. There was not really a whole lot of raised details anywhere else around that portion of the coat, and it looks like most of the coat was sitting flat. So what I wanted to do was make a rather large hole and then get some of that extra putty and make it look like part of that hole had kind of flapped over on top of itself. So I just went back in and reworked it a little bit. And again, you've got plenty of time. I was probably 20 minutes into it at this point, maybe even 25 minutes into it, and the putty's still workable. It hasn't dried yet. If anything, you just have to add a little bit of water back to the putty, whether you use a brush or you just get that tool, whatever tool it is, you get that tool a little wet, you can go back in and continue to rework it. And it's like any other thing with modeling, whether it's weathering or sanding and priming and sanding and priming. Everything kind of has that dance of going back and forth, and you work it, you blend it, it looks good, but something's not quite right, so you fix one thing and then you got to blend it back in, and you just wind up going all around until you're just finally satisfied with it, or you've just given it so much attention and time that you're really not making anything any better at that point. So that's the other good skill, is to be able to identify when you're not actually making any more progress, and the more you work it, you're actually at that where your material is starting to dry, or you're better off addressing it with sanding after you prime it. Sometimes it's easier to see how it actually looks once everything's one solid primer color. So the key takeaway that I usually have to tell myself is that we're not actually trying to get to 100% complete right now in this stage. We're just trying to get it maybe to that 80-90% where we can address everything else, either in the painting or the sanding, or after we've gotten a better look at it with that primer coat down. So here you've seen me using that X-Acto knife, and what I was using the X-Acto knife for was to get up underneath some of those putty edges and help kind of push the putty underneath itself and create that void where the wash can kind of flow into. We can get some natural shadow. We can enhance that with pen wash. The X-Acto is a really good tool because it's very precise there at the tip to be able to make those small folds or increase that ragged look on the edges while still trying to keep that look in scale. So that's essentially it for the technique here. Feel free to drop any questions into the comments below. Also, I'd love to hear if anyone's ever used a different technique. I imagine you can do something similar with this by using tissue paper and then tearing up the tissue paper to simulate that rip. I just think the putty gives me an adequate amount of control, and I'm not sure that I'd be able to achieve that with something like tissue paper. I got about another minute or so where I continue to clean this up, and then I've got some still photographs at the end where you can really see some of it up close. And I do want to go ahead and talk about the figure real quick. I really do like this figure from Berlinden. It's super straightforward. It's one piece. Cleanup is almost non-existent, and I didn't see any issues where I had to go in and fill any air bubbles or anything like that. The only downside is it doesn't really give you any equipment, but the helmet it does provide is at a really realistic angle. It's really smashed down over that soldier's face. On the plus side, you can customize it with any equipment that you have in the spare box. I've added a bolt action rifle with those ammo pouches there, but you could also make him him an MP40 submachine gun or anything like that. Just vary that equipment that you give him on his belt. My goal was to create an interesting figure that captured the viewer's attention, still realistic, but just a little different from the box art, and I think I achieved that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope I inspired somebody out there, and stay tuned for the next video when I get this guy painted up.